Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Today, I'm really pleased about the idea of having a book that is this rich and the opportunity to dive into it with you all. We always begin with this question of why read this book. I read Slaughterhouse 5 a long time ago and was absolutely taken by it. I am not a speculative / sci-fi fiction kind of person. And so I had always avoided Vonnegut. I also think of him, this is my thing about like dude books. I always think of him as being like very much like a dude writer. And I hate to gender any kind of fiction, but I would actually be interested to see how that breaks down in terms of numbers of readers, in terms of gender for Kurt Vonnegut. My guess is that it would be more men than women. But I was so happy when I actually did dive in and, got over the science fiction hurdle, because this book is really, there's certainly science fiction elements to it, but it is so much more. And I am also going to argue that the way that Vonnegut uses science fiction and metafiction, for that matter, the way he is doing it, the way that he uses it as a tool is absolutely breathtaking. So those of you who like an agenda, we are going to do a very quick Vonnegut bio. Then we're going to dive into the book and we're going to look very carefully at the title and some of the frontis matter, meaning like the dedication. And we're going to look at the structure of the book because it's extremely important. We're going to touch on the humor. The jacket blurbs of my copy call him hilarious, but also our finest Black humorist and also the laughing prophet of doom. And honestly, that last one seems like kind of the best description from my experience this time reading through the book. I needed the humor so badly because it was so dark in so many ways. And that is, in many ways, the genius of Vonnegut, that there is this leavening with humor. So we're going to talk about why the humor works so well. We're then going to really dig into this idea of metafiction. And along with that comes the idea of postmodernism, which those sound like really like lecture-y kind of things. But what is so astounding about Kurt Vonnegut is this book is very metafictive, but it is not an intellectual exercise. And it is not just an example of like formalist experimentation in literature. This is like, he is again using metafiction in a way that is so profound and I think unusual to make an incredibly important statement about war, also about death and mortality and time and religion. He is really tackling some very large things in this book, and we're going to take a look at those. We are going to, at the end, talk about the end of the book. So this, there are spoilers. You could use this, I think, as like a primer to read before you dive into the novel, but I'm definitely going to be, it's funny, I can't even really say that I'm going to be like spoiling the plot because a lot of the plot is announced very early on because of the incredible structure of the book. But if you're someone who's worried about, finding out what is going to happen in this novel, you should probably maybe read it first and then come back. Okay, we're going to dive in with this very brief biography of Kurt Vonnegut. He was born in 1922 and died in 2007. So he was 95 years old when he died. He was born in the Midwest. Very much, in fact, like the characters in this novel. He enlisted in the Second World War, and this is very important. He was captured by the Germans. He was in Dresden during the firebombing. He did survive in a slaughterhouse, and he did wait, 20 years or so to write this novel. So what's important there, of course, is that the entire novel is playing with this idea of how he is going to talk about his experience of the Second World War. What is the form that would even begin to describe like the horror of his experience of being in that firebombing of Dresden. Slaughterhouse 5 was published in 1969. Excellent year of my birth. It's really interesting, though, to think about it as an anti-war novel that is coming out right during the Vietnam era, just because if you think about it being published at that moment, it's even more, first of all, even more powerful, but in many ways kind of more inflammatory. And part of me wonders, it took Vonnegut a long time after the ending of the war to be able to articulate this. And part of me wonders if there was some urgency that was developing in the late 1960s, which kind of forced his hand a bit. The book itself was immediately a success. It's been banned widely for many different reasons, which is ridiculous, obviously. It was like, it spent, 17 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list right when it came out in 1969. It won a whole bunch of awards. It's in Time Magazine's top 100 books. It is also number 18 on the Modern Library 100 Best Novels. So this is a novel that is not only just an incredible piece of prose fiction and a very experimental and very effective structured novel, but it's also one that was extremely popular. And we're going to talk about that. It has a lot to do with the simplicity of the prose. It's incredible how his shorter sentences, his very plain diction, all of that allows the reader to enter into it really easily. And then he gets to kind of slip in all of this experimental stuff, also all of these very important messages, while the reader is kind of lulled by the plainness of the prose and also by the humor. I will say I am with a bunch of 20-year-olds right now, and my niece mentioned that she had read it in high school, and I was like, what? Because part of me is like, I just don't understand that as part of the high school curriculum in 2020. I mean, I am all for people reading this book at all ages. She did say that no one liked it, which that is the risk that you run when you have young people read a book that is, in fact, very adult in many ways, and also, pretty difficult. And I think it can be difficult. She said everyone was so confused and no one knew what was happening. I was kind of shocked that no one liked it. And I also just wonder what is happening to the youth. Are they no longer reading? It's a crisis for me, but I just try to pretend, like many other crises, I just try to block it out. Speaking of gender, though, I will say that there are a bunch of 20-year-olds who I've talked to about Vonnegut. These are these young lads in the book club in New York City. They love Vonnegut. I suggested this book when they were thinking about reading some other things, and they all were like, oh, obviously we already read that book. And they're huge fans. So perhaps the people that my niece was talking about in her class who didn't like it, maybe it was the young women. We're now going to dive into the text. So anyone who's listening to the Fox page in order to become a better reader, you all know that I resist the idea of anybody needing to learn to read better. But I do understand the idea of wanting to read more richly and wanting to get the most out of what you are reading. The simple advice, of course, is to slow down and pay attention. If you are reading writing that is worth its salt, it will really, really pay dividends to just focus a bit more on smaller details. The title of the book, of course, is not a small detail, but there are details about it that I think get lost and that are very much worth our while. So on the cover of my paperback edition, it simply says Slaughterhouse 5. But if you open the book, you have the title page. And on that title page, if you're on the YouTube, I'm holding it up for you with all of my weird marks all over it. It's actually very lovely looking the way that it is printed on the page. But what we have is this: Slaughterhouse 5, or The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death. So we're going to parse this just a tiny bit. Of course, Slaughterhouse 5 stands for the Americans' address when they are taken prisoners of war by the Germans at the end of World War II. So this would be a time in the war the Germans were pushing. It was their final push, and they were all at the front, but they were sending all of the prisoners back into the center of Germany. I did not realize that the bombing of Dresden was particularly horrible because it didn't have any munitions, and it wasn't like a place where they were manufacturing a lot of war goods. It was really very much just like this beautiful city, which obviously makes the whole thing more harrowing. So one of the most important things about the main title, Slaughterhouse 5, is that we do know, it is in the history records, that in fact Kurt Vonnegut, our author, survived the firebombing in a slaughterhouse, as did Billy Pilgrim. So this is one of these places where we have this congruence between the author and our protagonist that really adds to the urgency and the profundity of this novel. And it's really striking that we have it right at the beginning. Any title of any novel obviously is going to focus your attention. And there are many reasons why it's important here, in part because a slaughterhouse obviously is speaking about senseless slaughter. It's also this real perversion of domesticity, like a house is somewhere that you should be safe. So a slaughterhouse is really a place that should be safe and absolutely is not. It's also ironic, and it really speaks to the illogic nature of war, that these prisoners of war would be saved because they are in fact in a slaughterhouse. But the part of the title that's a little bit less clear is this idea of the Children's Crusade. It is one that doesn't get talked about. When my niece mentioned it, she did not say, oh, Slaughterhouse 5 or the Children's Crusade. And it's a little sad, although lots of subtitles do not get full billing. But what I do like about it is we have some very clear mentions of why the book is called The Children's Crusade. So I want to look very quickly at pages 18 and 19. This is in the beginning of the book when we have our narrator visiting with his friend, who was someone he had served with in the war. He's with his friend O'Hare at O'Hare's house, It's very interesting to me that he always refers to him as O'Hare. It seems like very like military kind of thing. But his wife, Mary, gets very angry and finally tells them why she is upset. And here's what she says. Then she turned to me, let me see how angry she was, and that anger was for me. She had been talking to herself, so what she said was fragments of a much larger conversation. You were just babies then, she said. What? I said. You were just babies in the war, like the ones upstairs. I nodded that this was true. We had been foolish virgins in the war, right at the end of childhood. But you're not going to write it that way, are you? This wasn't a question, it was an accusation. I don't know, I said. Well, I know, she said. You'll pretend you were men instead of babies, and you'll be played in the movies by Frank Sinatra or John Wayne or some of those other glamorous, war-loving, dirty old men, and war will look just wonderful, so we'll have a lot more of them, and they'll be fought by babies like the babies upstairs. And here's a very crucial part. I mean, we are on page 18 of the book, and we're having clearly this very anti-war message. So then I understood. It was war that made her so angry. She didn't want her babies or anybody else's babies killed in wars. And she thought wars were partly encouraged by books and movies. I'm going to interject right there and say that I'm very happy that I think these days a lot of movies that we see are not in fact celebratory of war and in fact really speak to the horror of it. But then what we have here is this really excellent kind of metafictive moment, which reads this. So I held up my right hand and I made a promise. Mary, I said, I don't think this book of mine is ever going to be finished. I must have written 5,000 pages by now and thrown them all away. If I ever do finish it, though, I give you my word of honor. There won't be a part for Frank Sinatra or John Wayne. I'll tell you what, I said. I'll call it The Children's Crusade. She was my friend after that. So what we have here is this like punctuation of the text of the novel. We're reading a chapter of the novel. This is not a preface. It's not a foreword. It's the first chapter of the novel. And yet we have this vision of the author of the novel talking about the title of the book. We're going to talk a little later about metafiction. But what this is doing is already playing with this idea of how is it that an author is going to represent war in a way that is horrible enough to be, it's not an accurate representation of his experience, but maybe like an emotionally accurate one. Obviously, this book is very anti-war, and it's bigger than that in lots of ways. Again, it talks about mortality, it talks about fate, it talks about religion, it talks about love, all sorts of different things. But this subtitle is very important. So we have it mentioned there in that first chapter when we have our stand-in for Kurt Vonnegut, the author of the book. But it also comes up in the text of the novel itself. So on page 135, this is when we have Derby, the character Derby, who is one of the people who Billy Pilgrim is in the war with. And this Derby guy is much older. He's 45 years old, and all the rest of them are like 18. And when Derby first sees them all, this is what he says. This is Derby talking to an English colonel. Derby told him he was 45, which was 2 years older than the colonel. The colonel said that the other Americans had all shaved now, that Billy and Derby were the only two still with beards. And he said, you know, we've had to imagine the war here, and we've imagined that it was being fought by aging men like ourselves. We had forgotten that wars were fought by babies. When I saw those freshly shaved faces, it was a shock. My God, I said to myself, it's the children's crusade. So here we have this beautiful echo of this subtitle. We also have like a long digression at one point about the actual crusades, the Christian crusades, and about the children's crusade. But it is very deftly woven not only into the title, like not only is hopefully, not only is our attention focused on it because of the title, but again, because we have this whole backstory with Mary O'Hare, and we know why, in fact, it's called that. And then we have this other idea that the title of the book is a really accurate reflection of these babies, of these young men who were actually fighting the Second World War. And just when you thought we were going to dive in, further into the text, I want to talk about the rest of this really involved and very kind of fruitful title page here. So we have Slaughterhouse 5 or The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death. I have to say that I did not dive into that fully. And I actually didn't see any resonances. I mean, obviously, the duty dance with death, that describes the whole entire thing, but I did not see it written verbatim in the rest of the text. But then we have by Kurt Vonnegut Jr., and this is the interesting part to me. This is highly unusual. I mean, usually when you have the biography of of the author. It's set apart with a little photo, and it's kind of a little blurby kind of paragraph, and it basically says like maybe where they live and maybe a bunch of awards that they have won or whatever. But in this case, we have it folded into the title. It's really, if we are paying attention, it really should be standing out in a very different way, and in fact a very important way, that is really talking about the positionality of this author. The author, Kurt Vonnegut, is really wanting us to know a bunch of stuff about him, because it does make the way that he involves himself in the book way more resonant. So what we have is this. By Kurt Vonnegut Jr., a fourth-generation German-American now living in easy circumstances on Cape Cod and smoking too much, who, as an American infantry scout hors de combat, as a prisoner of war, witnessed the firebombing of Dresden, Germany, the Florence of the Elbe, a long time ago, and survived to tell the tale. This is a novel somewhat in the telegraphic, schizophrenic manner of tales of the planet Tralfamador, where flying saucers come from. Peace. Okay, I mean, obviously I cannot get enough of the fact that he ends with that word peace. We have this whole description, period, and then peace. And for those of you on the YouTube, you can even see that it's set off in a way that makes it very powerful. It's the last word we are expected to read on this page. But one of the things that was really striking to me here is that he's talking about being a German American, which really struck me in this read because I think he's really trying to erode all of these differences. I mean, I think we can all agree, especially with all of the global conflict that's happening these days, that people are not that different. I mean, culturally, people can be very different, but that we are all human beings and that national lines are often very arbitrary. It's also very interesting and important that we have this kind of detail here, that he was in fact in the firebombing of Dresden, and he reiterates the fact that it's in Germany. And then this idea that is the Florence of the Elbe really speaks to the idea of it being a very important and sort of artistic and very culturally beautiful city, and not one that's like producing all of the munitions for the war. And then lastly, we have the part about the telegraphic schizophrenic style of the Tralfamadorians. And this is a hugely important thing. We're going to talk about the structure of the book. Very famously, Billy Pilgrim is loose in time. He is going back and forth in time. And one of the things that happens in his life that we learn about, sort of in random, not random, definitely not random, but in seemingly random chunks throughout the novel, is we realize that he has been held captive on the planet of Tralfamador. Tralfamador and actually a bunch of these characters appear again in other works by Kurt Vonnegut. And I mentioned before that I'm not like a huge sci-fi person, but this was so clear to me and it's very effective. I think that what he is doing in part with the idea of Tralfamador and this idea of this other planet, this alien planet, is to provide us a totally different cosmology and a totally different philosophy and a totally different sense of time and sexuality and violence and death. So if you're going to sit down and you're going to write a book about a horrible, like unimaginable war experience, and you are a very generous writer, you might in fact try to provide some kind of solace and maybe some kind of alternative way to look at the horror of the war. So one of the things that Tralfamador does is it gives us a vision of a different way to live, which obviously throws into contrast all of the ways that the way that Americans live. And it's really asking us to look at some of the things that we really take for granted. And so right from the start, we have this introduction of this science fiction element that I would argue is crucial, not because of the sort of daring nature of the speculative part or the shock value of it, but just because of this idea of like a place that believes in different things that might be helpful for humans also to think about. Okay, very briefly, we have the dedication for Mary O'Hare and Gerhard Mueller. And this is very interesting too, because here we have the dedication, and I think we can all agree that when an author is dedicating a book to someone, that person is a real person. And so what Vonnegut is doing here is very subtle, but it's actually very important. When we dive into that very first paragraph, where we are invited to conflate our narrator and our author, we are very much invited to see Kurt Vonnegut as our author and our narrator in that first chapter. And the inclusion here of Mary O'Hare, the idea that he is going to dedicate this book to a real person, is a way that we can confirm, in fact, that the first chapter of the novel is like a true story. We also have Gerhard Mueller, who was the taxi driver who drove them around in Dresden, which is, to my mind, slightly less significant. Also because, obviously, Mary O'Hare is one of the main kind of anti-war voices in the book. Then we move on and we have this kind of gut-wrenching and actually very Christmassy epigraph. The cattle are lowing, the baby awakes, but the little Lord Jesus no crying he makes. So there is a lot of religion in this book. In many ways, I think you can read Billy Pilgrim, who is a pilgrim, who is making a pilgrimage. Again, you just got to pay attention here, people, and things jump out at you when you have a writer as good as Vonnegut. So we have this guy who is a pilgrim, but we also have this idea of being somewhat unable to emote. Significantly, the only time that Billy Pilgrim does cry is when he sees the suffering of the horses. But right at the beginning, we have this very important inclusion of religion. I mean, gosh, I am sure that there are people who have written like gigantic dissertations about religion in this book. I think we are invited to see Billy Pilgrim as a Jesus figure, but we are also invited to see him as, someone who has experienced alien travel. Perhaps that is one of the statements that he is trying to make, that we have a certain cosmology that has to do with sacrifice and mortality and death and heaven and hell versus this Tralfamadorian vision of death. So one of the things we do here at the Fox page in order to really understand a text better is to take a close look at like the first line or the first paragraph. Because if, especially in a challenging text, the first paragraph or the first line will really help you understand where you want to focus your attention, what kind of narrator you're dealing with, what kind of registers are going to be employed. And I would argue that the first chapter, because it is this kind of nonfiction thing, it's kind of like a preface in many ways. In some ways, it acts as a frame. This is when we have Kurt Vonnegut visiting Bernard O'Hare. So in some ways, we have this beginning to the first chapter, and then the second through ninth chapters are all removed a little bit more. I mean, you would argue, in fact, that it is still Kurt Vonnegut and that our author has sort of become this narrator. And in fact, there are lots of intrusions throughout where Kurt Vonnegut will say, "That was me." There'll be another soldier near Billy Pilgrim, and that other soldier will be doing something, notably shitting his brains out, which is one of the things that happens. And then we will have these incredible intrusions where the narrator will say, "That was me." So we have our narrator author introducing himself and giving us the frame in the first chapter. And then that narrator takes a bit of a step back and really is telling the story of Billy Pilgrim. I think there's some people who want to conflate Kurt Vonnegut and Billy Pilgrim. He has spoken, in fact, about how Billy Pilgrim is modeled on someone that he knew in the war. And I think also if you're a careful reader and you have these little intrusions and you note the fact that like Kurt Vonnegut / our narrator is intruding, you can see that Vonnegut is in fact trying to create some distance. I think that very firmly Billy Pilgrim is our protagonist, and I like the distance between the two. I think it's one of the reasons why things work so well. So on page 1, at the very beginning of the first chapter, we have this very meta kind of beginning to the book. All this happened, more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. One guy I knew really was shot in Dresden for taking a teapot that wasn't his. Another guy I knew really did threaten to have his personal enemies killed by hired gunmen after the war. And so on. I've changed all the names. So that one thing that I really love about the beginning here is this idea that it is true. All this happened, and then there's this qualifier. All this happened, more or less. And then we say, the war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. So he's speaking in the beginning in this way that I really love about the impossibility of having things be like true. I mean, I think for everyone's intents and purposes, these things are true. These are facts that happened to him. But we also know that the human memory is fallible. But obviously from this, we get the sense that he is wanting us to understand that this stuff is true. And when he says the war parts are true, they really, in many ways, are the most crucial part. We have lots of stuff about Billy Pilgrim's life after the war, his life before the war, his life on Tralfamador. But I think the things that are most affecting and most crucial in the book are the war parts. So we have these two examples, the guy who was shot in Dresden and then the other guy who's going to hire the gunman after the war. And then we have this and so on. So what he's inviting us to do there is to think of all the other things that are like these other horrible things that happened in the war. So we have this way that he's kind of dilating. He's giving us two examples and then dilating the moment so that we are invited to like think of all of the other things that are terrible that might have happened, which is this huge thing. And then masterfully, he brings it right back down by saying, I've changed all the names. So we have this very like big kind of way that the book is expanding, and then and this is so Vonnegut, because then he brings it back down in this very clear, very sparse, and very practical kind of way. I've changed all the names. So I want to move from there to the opening of the second chapter, which in some ways is like a second opening of the novel. So on page 29, we have this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. So this is so crucial. First of all, we have this listen, and that is this idea, well, it's so masterful. That's direct address. So this is our narrator directly addressing the reader and saying like, you listen. And anytime we have direct address, this could be a very subconscious thing for most readers. What we have there is ourselves being brought into the novel. So when a narrator says something like, hey, listen, you really do have a sense that they are speaking directly and intimately to you. And then we have this really intriguing beginning. Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. So one of the things that's happening that's important there is that's the present progressive. So this is something that is still happening. It's not Billy Pilgrim was unstuck in time. It is Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. So that idea that it is still happening is important because the book is really playing with the idea of time. And of course, if you are paying attention to the Tralfamador parts, you know, in fact, that time, that every single thing that is happening is still, in fact, happening. And then we have a paragraph that's going to really, I mean, again, if you're really wanting to understand something and get the most out of it, a paragraph like this third one at the beginning of chapter 2, which is really, I think, in some ways the beginning of the novel, he's going to tell us what is happening and how we are supposed to read this book that is not structured in the way most novels are. So we have this third paragraph. Billy has gone to sleep a senile widower and awakened on his wedding day. He was walked through a door in 1955 and come out another in 1941. He has gone back through that door to find himself in 1963. He has seen his birth and death many times, he says, and pays random visits to all the events in between, he says. I find this so moving. There's something about the tentative nature of this. Like all of the things that are being presented to us in this novel have these kind of qualifiers. And I think, again, when I consider the science fiction element of this book, one of the ways that it's most interesting for me to think about is it's kind of a metaphor. So this idea of becoming loose in time and moving around in time the way that he does, in many ways, it's just sort of a way to conceive of how humans think about the past. I mean, in many ways, our past lives, and even people who have died, those things are still very vivid for us, and they are, in fact, constantly intruding on our present moment. There's also a way that Vonnegut here, when he's saying he says, is aligning a little bit with the reader and saying like, okay, this is what this guy Billy Pilgrim says about his experience, and you and I, narrator and reader, are in it together, and we're both sort of like, okay, that's what he's saying, but we're going to have to think a little bit about how to understand it all. So now that we've read these opening paragraphs, I want to talk for a minute about the structure of the book. We're not going to dive into this too deeply, but what he is doing is crucial. So I want to briefly talk about postmodernism. So in literature, we have realism, which was the latter half of the 19th century, so sort of 1815 to 1910. That is, I mean, most novels today that we read are in the realist tradition. You have an omniscient narrator, things are chronological, you are looking at things mostly from the outside, things are being reported to you, this happened and then that happened. And the way that the world functions in these novels is relatively similar to the way that our world actually functions. So after World War I, famously, a bunch of people, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, they had this very strong literary reaction, which was this idea that they needed to find a new way to talk about reality because in some ways it had been shattered. So what you had was this focus on the interiority, a focus on feelings, a focus on how people were perceiving things, not this kind of realist idea of looking at things from the outside. All of a sudden, things got very fragmentary. And I think if you just think about all of that modernist literature as being like a little difficult to understand and a little opaque and a little demanding, that's because the idea of conceiving of what was happening in the world was also all of those things. So then we have postmodernism. And in terms of literature, it's mostly in the 60s and 70s, so there's a little bit of a gap there. I think we kind of just basically went back to realism. But the postmodernist novel does share some things with modernism. One, you have this idea of formal experimentation. So in much the same way that Virginia Woolf would play with time, we have this idea of things being fragmented and non-linear in time. We also have a real focus on the interior perception. And one thing that postmodernism does that we don't have as much of in modernism is we have this idea of thinking about the thing that we are reading. This is that meta part. So meta anything just means that it is self-referential. It is something that is referring to itself. So when we are holding this book and we have this conversation of a character who is in the book, in chapter 1, when he is having a conversation with Mary O'Hara and he's like, okay, when I write my book, I'm going to call it The Children's Crusade. And the book you are holding in your hand is called The Children's Crusade. That is an example of self-referential literature because the creation of the thing is being described in the thing. And one of the main ways that we see it in Vonnegut is all throughout you have the narrator, who we are invited to conflate with Kurt Vonnegut. We have him popping up and reminding us every time he appears next to Billy Pilgrim that someone is writing this, that there is someone who is a real person who experienced many of the same things that Billy Pilgrim also experienced. So if you take one thing away from this lecture, I hope it would maybe be this thing, which is that a lot of times postmodernist literature and a lot of times like metafictive literature can just be kind of like an intellectual exercise. And frankly, I really like that in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's just like a puzzle, and it can be very satisfying to think about it and to be forced to kind of understand it. But what Vonnegut is doing here, I think, is so much more important. What he is doing is taking this idea of metafiction, this idea of the intrusion of the author and the fragmentation and all of the ways that this book is not just a straightforward linear novel. And almost at every single turn, we are reminded that this horrific experience that Billy Pilgrim is having is very much the same, if not exactly the same, as someone named Kurt Vonnegut. So every single time we have, this is it's a novel, it's a piece of fiction, and yet the savvy reader is going to see that it really truly is not, that emotionally all of these things are true because they were experienced by our author. So instead of just having those intrusions feel kind of like experimental and interesting, they're reinforcing the idea that this war is real and that it was experienced by someone who is, walking the earth, and someone who really had to struggle to find a way to talk about something that was so terrible. Okay, I want to make one last comment about the structure before we move on. So we have this very important way that the first chapter of the book, because they are told by our narrator, but because they are woven into the text, they're inviting us to see Kurt Vonnegut, who is a real person. They're inviting us to see that this experience is one that he had. It's a novel, but it's real. So that is interesting enough. But then this idea of Billy Pilgrim as being unstuck in time, and this idea of the novel itself as being super fragmented and as being not at all like the normal novel, is also crucial because this idea of this structure as being kind of absurd and kind of senseless and kind of unmoored and kind of like upsetting in some ways, all of the jarring nature and all of the confusion of it really ought to signal to you as a reader that this is the experience of what it's like to be in a war. So this idea of using formal experimentation, when I say formal experimentation, I just mean they're experimenting with form. It's an author who is writing not, again, just sort of a linear novel, but is writing something different. The idea here of having this being kind of disorienting, little confusing, all of that is to say that this is the experience not only of someone in the war, but also of someone after the war. So structurally, it's just an incredible feat. And before we move on to humor, I just want to weigh in on this big debate. So there's this very robust debate. I mean, it's not quite so robust anymore, probably. But a lot of people have put a lot of time into this question of like, is the experience of being unstuck in time, the experience with Tralfamador, all of the science fiction elements of the book, is that all a hallucination on the part of Billy Pilgrim? Or is it in fact that Billy Pilgrim is actually having these experiences? So, of course, people argue this in all sorts of different ways. The people who are arguing that this is all, a PTSD thing and that Billy Pilgrim is just hallucinating these experiences, they speak to the fact that at one point Billy Pilgrim puts himself into a hospital, so like a mental breakdown situation. They would have called it shell shock or battle fatigue or whatever back in the day. But the sense that he would have been in a position where he might have kind of like dreamed up this whole experience of going to another planet. People also argue that because there are a bunch of elements that are in like the real part of the story, like we see Montana Wildhack, who's the sex worker that he ends up with on Tralfamador. There's one of her tapes, I think, is in one of the pornography shops off of Times Square. We have a bunch of different elements that are in like Billy Pilgrim's real actual life on Earth. And so people argue that those things are all woven into this idea of his life on Tralfamador, essentially that the life that being on the other planet never happened, but that he just dreamed it up and weaved in all of these different elements that we see in the normal part of the narration. And then there are people, all the sci-fi people, who argue that like his experience on Tralfamador actually happened within the scope of the novel. And I find this debate so silly because honestly, both of those things are happening. I mean, you as the reader are experiencing him on Tralfamador with Montana Wildhack. You are also experiencing him, in the pornography shop, seeing one of her tapes. So really both of those things, I mean, you can argue it in both ways, essentially. And furthermore, it's just not important. I mean, this parsing of the mechanics of this trip to Tralfamador and whether or not we are meant to believe that it's actually part of what happens to Billy Pilgrim in the novel does not matter. I think that what we should be focusing on more is what it is that Tralfamador is representing, whether it is a hallucination or an actual experience. And I'm not going to repeat everything I said at the beginning, but I think in many ways it is meant to provide a completely different blueprint for how we can think about life and suffering and love and sexuality and time. So it really doesn't matter to me whether, in fact, it was a hallucination or an actual trip into space. So we're going to move on and talk a little bit about the humor in the book. And part of the reason I want to do this is just because it's such a joy to dip into the prose and to see how smart and how complicated and yet very simple all of the work is. So on page 134, this is when Billy he's a prisoner of war at this point. Now the head Englishman came into the hospital to check on Billy. He was an infantry colonel captured at Dunkirk. It was he who had given Billy morphine. There wasn't a real doctor in the compound, so the doctoring was up to him. "How's the patient?" he asked Derby. "Dead to the world." "But not actually dead." "No." Which I honestly just thought that was so funny. It's so dark. And it also is doing all kinds of work. So we have this idea of just the kind of desperate nature of the war. I mean, this is someone who's like, he's not a doctor, and yet he's giving people morphine and he's having to do all of the doctoring. And then we have, of course, what he means there when he says dead to the world is this expression that he's like passed out, like he's asleep. And then this very, very deadpan reaction to that when Derby says dead to the world, but not actually dead. No. So we have this exchange that's very dry and that's kind of trafficking both in death, but also in humor, and also actually kind of makes you think a little bit about sleep and death. It's one of these things that's slightly thought-provoking. And this is the kind of humor, I mean, it's not like ha-ha, laugh out loud funny. It's not slapstick. It's not just like over the top. It's very clever, and it's almost always very dark. But these are points that I really needed some leavening and was very happy that we had these clever moments that are very funny. So on page 148, so this is actually when Billy is on Tralfamador. And there's a long paragraph of Billy saying all of these different things. And the very last line of that paragraph, I'm going to read that and then the following part. "So tell me the secret so I can take it back to Earth and save us all. How can a planet live at peace?" Billy felt that he had spoken soaringly. He was baffled when he saw the Tralfamadorians close their little hands on their eyes. He knew from past experience what this meant. He was being stupid. So in many ways, this is very sad, but there is something about, and again, this is like my favorite kind of speculative fiction, this idea that the Tralfamadorians are shaped like plumber's helpers, and that they have like a little hand at the top and that the eye in the middle, you can see them like closing their little fingers over their eyes, just like, oh my gosh, like shaking their heads kind of, but they don't have heads. This reminded me so much of George Saunders. If you have not read The Brief and Frightening Reign of Phil, you absolutely must read that. But folded into this kind of like light and kind of humorous little description of these aliens is this idea, like he has this it's the most important question in the whole entire book. How can a planet live in peace? It's huge. It's like the whole crux of the novel. And then we have these little aliens just being like, what? Like, we can't tell you that. Humans on Earth will never be able to do that. And then we have this kind of like kicker at the end. Like he thinks he's spoken soaringly. They do their like little eye closing thing. And then he was being stupid, which is both like so sad and so kind of defeated, but also funny because it is so plain and in some ways kind of juvenile and excellent. This next example of humor that I'm going to read is like a little bit crude and a little bit part of why I think of this as kind of like a dude book in some ways, but it's doing a bunch of really important work. Okay, so on 168, this is when the Tralfamadorians have brought Montana Wild Hack to live with Billy Pilgrim in the zoo on the alien planet. Montana was under heavy sedation. Tralfamadorians wearing gas masks brought her in, put her on Billy's yellow lounge chair, withdrew through the airlock. The vast crowd outside was delighted. All attendance records for the zoo were broken. Everybody on the planet wanted to see the Earthling's mate. Montana was naked, and so was Billy, of course. He had a tremendous wang, incidentally. You never know who'll get one. So I thought that was funny. But I also want to speak about the important things that are happening here. So part of the reason why this book is so charming is because it is so grounded in reality. This idea of the yellow lounge chair really speaks in many ways to kind of the mundane nature of everything that is happening, both in terms of all of these incredibly important details of the war that Billy is experiencing, also the details of his regular life. The fact that he's an optometrist, I mean, on one hand, that seems just like kind of like a very like mundane thing to be. But if you are a careful reader and you step back, you will think about the fact that an optometrist is someone who helps people see. It's someone who clarifies things for people. I mean, it is the perfect thing if you're writing an anti-war book to have someone who's like the protagonist who's had this horrible experience, actually cannot articulate it, but having him trying to help people see reality. It's so, there is nothing in this book that is not well thought through. So the other thing that's interesting to me here is this speaks to the prose styling of Kurt Vonnegut. He's unbelievably good just at writing. So here's the sentence quickly. Tralfamadorians wearing gas masks brought her in, put her on Billy's yellow lounge chair, withdrew through his airlock. So what we have here, this is not a run-on sentence, even though it kind of sounded just like three phrases all stuck together. We have a semicolon between the second and third phrases. They put her on Billy's yellow lounge chair, semicolon, withdrew through the airlock. It is a fragment because there is no subject in that second part. But normally you would have like an and here. They did this, they did that, and they withdrew through the airlock. But he is taking it out in part to make us pay a little more attention and to see that these things are kind of very mechanized on the part. They're just like doing their things. It's very much like they have this list of how they're going to handle these people. But in other parts of the book, we have something called polysyndeton. There's a lot of it where he uses extra ands. So it would be that Billy Pilgrim did this and did that and did the next thing. And what that does, and he does it with or too, it's so... it seems like a minor thing, but this is an example of, I could talk for hours and hours about the quality of the prose. When you have polysyndeton like that repetition of and instead of using commas, it slows everything down. It also makes everything feel on par with everything else. You don't have a sense of like one of those things being more important than the others. It's a really very subtle, obviously, but very effective way to convey what it is he is trying to get across. I wasn't going to read this last example of humor, but I'm going to because it rests largely on the fact that Vonnegut is using excellent italicization. You can't say that. He's using excellent italics. So this is when we have Paul Lazzaro, who is a very important character in many ways. He is, in fact, the person who is responsible for Billy Pilgrim's death. He also is this very important link between Billy Pilgrim's future and that terrible moment when they're in the car, when the other soldier, whose name is totally escaping me, when he is dying, and he's the one who wants the revenge. So Paul Lazzaro is just like a really tough guy, and we have this conversation between him and Billy. So importantly, I'm going to interject this right now. Billy he's been called an innocent in a lot of different literature about this book, and he absolutely is that. He's not armed. He comes as like the chaplain's assistant. Like he's just so much kind of sacrificing himself. And the whole time when they're trying to escape, he basically just keeps trying to give up and give up and give up. So the idea of this very innocent person in contrast to someone like Paul Lazaro is striking. So Paul Lazaro starts speaking. I went past where they had the dog tied up. He wanted to bite me again. I said to him, "Come on, doggy, let's be friends. Let's not be enemies anymore. I'm not mad." He believed me. He did? So that's the he did part is in italics, the did part. And there are many things that are important here. Obviously, this discussion of enemies and how Paul Lazaro is trying to sort of not be enemies, even with a dog. But then this idea that the dog believed him. And the fact that Billy Pilgrim is so kind of baldly saying like he did, what he's saying, of course, is that Paul Lazaro is a really terrible dude. But we see a certain boldness here with Billy Pilgrim. It's also so important because he is having this conversation with the man who is ultimately going to be responsible for his death, which importantly happens outside the scope of the novel. So we have that italics right there. And then 2 pages later on 179, we have another set of excellent italics. This is when Derby is talking to Lazaro. Lazaro said that he could have anybody in the world killed for $1,000 plus traveling expenses. He had a list in his head, he said. It's so funny, the $1,000 plus traveling expenses, the mundane nature of that and the kind of pragmatic part is so funny to me. And then Derby asked him who all was on the list, and Lazaro said, "Just make fucking sure you don't get on it." You there is italicized. "Just don't cross me, that's all." There was a silence, and then he added, "And don't cross my friends." You have friends? Derby wanted to know. Which part is so funny too, again, because Derby's being so upfront about it, but like it's unexpected in this case because we already had a beat. So he's like, "Don't cross me, that's all." Then there's kind of a beat, and then he says, "And don't cross my friends." And then the comedic timing there is so good because you're expecting that to be the end, the way the cadence works. And then we have Derby saying, "You have friends?" It's just so, it's a funny and kind of light way to speak to just like the horror of this guy, Paul Lazaro, who just the page before literally said that revenge is the best thing in life. This humor is working so hard. So I want to talk about this idea of fatalism and this idea of how freeing fatalism can be. And then we're going to talk about the close of the novel. So one of the things that the structure does is show us that Billy Pilgrim has no control. He is totally not in control of like what is going to happen to him next. And that, to the careful reader, should be a metaphor for life in general, if you are someone who is very fatalistic. And when I say fatalistic, I simply mean that it's like with fate, like that the way that your life is going to go is the way it's going to go, and that essentially you don't really have free will. You don't have any way to actually affect what is coming at you. And if you think for 1 second about a young person being in a war, you can certainly imagine how you would get to have that sense that you do not have control. You have no idea what's going to happen next. You really can't do anything about it. And that people will make up all sorts of different ways to sort of handle the idea that you don't, in fact, have a lot of control. So we have the structure mimicking that, but we also have this very cool way in which the Tralfamadorians take that idea of this fate thing, like this fatalistic thing, this idea that we don't have any free will, we don't have any control to change our circumstances or our futures, and they actually make it sort of positive. There's this idea of being kind of free if you accept the fact that you don't really have any control. So at one point they're talking about the end of the earth, that they already know how the earth is going to end. So what happens is this guy presses the button and that leads to the end of the earth. On page 149, the Tralfamadorians are explaining to him why in fact they aren't going to do anything to save Earth. It reads, "He has always pressed it, and he always will. We always let him, and we always will let him. The moment is structured that way." So because they can see time, they talk about time as like looking at the Rocky Mountains. And I did this weird thing where I was looking at the Rocky Mountains in my mind as if they were moving forward. Like I was kind of looking like I was kind of perpendicular to the Rocky Mountains, and I was looking at them probably because of how I would conceive of time as moving away from me in a linear line. Like if I were up in Canada looking down at the Rockies. But what he means, I now am fairly certain, is that if you look at them from the side, so you can sort of see all of the different peaks at the same time, if they are kind of in a plane in front of you, instead of you looking down it like a line, you have the sense that, again, that everything is always happening. And this extends to the idea of death, that no one's actually dead because everything that has come before them is still happening. which I honestly have some questions philosophically about like what happens moving forward, but I guess there is no forward. I don't know. But on page 150, this is just one page later, they actually articulate this idea of like how freeing it feels to sort of accept that we have no free will. So they say this: ignore the awful times and concentrate on the good ones, which honestly, I mean, that is great advice. So one of the things that's so remarkable about the book is it's really entertaining. It's really dark, but it's also funny. It's deeply pacifist, or anti-war certainly, but it's also making this very, very large statement about literally how we conceive of our fate and of human will. It's incredible that so many very large questions are being explored so deeply in a novel that is funny and that has very clear prose. It's definitely fragmented and structured in a unique and sometimes challenging way. But I love the idea of all of these very large questions being explored within it. And before we move away from this idea of like these deeply philosophical things that are happening in the novel, I've been talking about them in like pretty wide scope, things like the structure, things that kind of run through the whole thing. But one of the things that Vonnegut does so well is he has these kind of small comments that he makes, small in the sense that they're like packaged in a beautiful single small paragraph, but they really speak to much larger things in ways that are so profound. It's also honestly just such a joy to think about this prose and to read it out loud. On page 49, we have this description of Billy Pilgrim's mother. There's, again, a lot of stuff about religion, and she always said that once she found the right religion, she would join that church. She never did decide. She did develop a terrific hankering for a crucifix, though, and she bought one from a Santa Fe gift shop during a trip the little family made out west during the Great Depression. Like so many Americans, she was trying to construct a life that made sense from things she found in gift shops. I mean, unbelievable. It's so true. Then on page 90, we have this example of just sort of like humans and how humanity functions. This is dark, and it's just so beautiful. This is when they're all in the train car being transported, all of the soldiers together. Human beings in there were excreting into steel helmets, which were passed to the people at the ventilators who dumped them. Billy was a dumper. I mean, honestly, there we have a little bit of that levity and that kind of like homespun feel, the repetition of dumped and dumper, and the idea of Billy was a dumper. It's just, there's something about the actual word itself that works so well to bring this like very difficult moment kind of down to earth. The human beings also passed canteens, which guards would fill with water. When food came in, the human beings were quiet and trusting and beautiful. They shared. It's so beautiful. In a book that is so difficult and dark in many ways, it's such a beautiful thing when we have these examples of human beings as really showing like a lot of compassion and a lot of humanity. Before we look at the very end of the book, I just wanted to read two little passages. And the reason I wanted to look at them is because of the evergreen nature of this book. Again, it's published in 1969. It's almost 56 years old. But in many ways, it feels like it is speaking directly to the present moment. On 164, we have a very distressing description of Americans. This is all in italics, and this is one of the many times when our narrator has included other texts. There's parts about the Children's Crusade, crusades in general. This is a monograph that is published by this guy, Howard W. Campbell Jr., who he literally is an American who becomes a Nazi, which kind of fits, in fact, with his description here of American people. America is the wealthiest nation on earth, but its people are mainly poor, and poor Americans are urged to hate themselves. To quote the American humorist Ken Hubbard, "It ain't no disgrace to be poor, but it might as well be." It is, in fact, a crime for an American to be poor, even though America is a nation of poor. Every other nation has folk traditions of men who were poor but extremely wise and virtuous, and therefore more estimable than anyone with power and gold. No such tales are told by the American poor. They mock themselves and glorify their betters. The meanest eating or drinking establishment, owned by a man who is himself poor, is very likely to have a sign on its wall asking this cruel question: "If you're so smart, why ain't you rich?" There will also be an American flag, no larger than a child's hand, glued to a lollipop stick and flying from the cash register. So as someone who has thought a lot about the American dream, this really spoke to me, and the idea that we have made very little progress from 1969 to 2025 was the kind of dispiriting thing that really does, in fact, come from this book, but also adds to its gravitas and its urgency. To close today, I want to take a look at the very end of the book. This is the last kind of page and a half. It's really, really dark, but it's very important. And one of the reasons why it feels so important to me is this is one of these descriptions of the Dresden fire bombings that you can imagine that maybe Kurt Vonnegut experienced. This is one of the war elements that he says, in fact, is true. And I think for an anti-war novel and one that is structurally very innovative, it's important to end with something that is just very clearly a description of the horror of war. So on page 271, they're describing how the prisoners of war, once they realized that they were alive and they came out and saw the rubble that used to be Dresden, they were made to start shoveling to see what they might be able to find, certainly looking for bodies. Many holes were dug at once. Nobody knew yet what there was to find. Most holes came to nothing. And then a little further down, Billy and the Maori, I mean, happily, this is one of those ways that we would say like a man from New Zealand or something. We wouldn't say the Maori, or maybe you would, like the equivalent of like the Spaniard. This is a native person from New Zealand. And it continues. Billy and the Maori and others helping them with their particular hole came at last to a membrane of timbers laced over rocks which had wedged together to form an accidental dome. They made a hole in the membrane. There was darkness and space under there. A German soldier with a flashlight went down into the darkness, was gone a long time. When he finally came back, he told the superior on the rim of the hole that there were dozens of bodies down there. They were sitting on benches, they were unmarked. So it goes. A couple of important things here. This idea of them sitting on benches, that is the kind of detail that is absolutely crucial and also excruciating. There is an adage in writing that what the best writers will do is give you the detail that you couldn't have come up with yourself. So if someone said, imagine a bombed out city and imagine young prisoners of war digging in that rubble, you will imagine all sorts of things. What you might not imagine is the fact that when they find all of these corpses, that they would be sitting. It is the unexpected detail that really makes things vivid and also gives real credibility and real verisimilitude to the text. Also, this idea of so it goes is crucial. So this so it goes is something that the Tralfamadorians say about death. And every time there is a death in the book, we have this phrase, so it goes. And in many ways, it's kind of an optimistic thing because it's going. If you have this idea of so it goes, I mean, it's also very fatalistic, like this is just how it goes. But I also love the fact that throughout, Vonnegut uses that phrase, so it goes, for all kinds of deaths, whether it's the death of a horse, or like at one point the champagne bottle opened and then it loses its bubbles, and we have this idea of that being a sort of death, and so we have so it goes. And I think in some ways it's very like a Tralfamadorian thing to have us be thinking about death and thinking about death more broadly, not just humans. This is like a very early post-humanist thing. The idea that all sorts of things, not just humans, are experiencing death and deserve our compassion. Okay, they find these bodies, and we have so it goes. The superior said that the opening in the membrane should be enlarged, and that a ladder should be put in the hole so that the bodies could be carried out. Thus began the first corpse mine in Dresden. There were hundreds of corpse mines operating by and by. They didn't smell bad at first, were wax museums. But then the bodies rotted and liquefied, and the stink was like roses and mustard gas. Roses and mustard gas is a type of refrain that we see verbatim that comes up. There are many of them throughout the book. Okay, so it goes. The Maori Billy had worked with died of the dry heaves after having been ordered to go down in that stink and work. He tore himself to pieces, throwing up and throwing up. So it goes. So a new technique was devised. Bodies weren't brought up anymore. They were cremated by soldiers with flamethrowers right where they were. The soldiers stood outside the shelters, simply sent the fire in. Somewhere in there, the poor old high school teacher, Edgar Derby, was caught with a teapot he had taken from the catacombs. He was arrested for plundering. He was tried and shot. So it goes. And somewhere in there was springtime. The corpse mines were closed down. The soldiers all left to fight the Russians. In the suburbs, the women and children dug rifle pits. Billy and the rest of his group were locked up in the stable in the suburbs. And then, one morning, they got up to discover that the door was unlocked. World War II in Europe was over. Such a good example of how anticlimactic that would be. Even just in terms of prose, it's anticlimactic. Billy and the rest wandered out onto the shady street. The trees were leafing out. There was nothing going on out there, no traffic of any kind. There was only one vehicle, an abandoned wagon drawn by 2 horses. The wagon was green and coffin-shaped. Birds were talking. One bird said to Billy Pilgrim, "Poo-tee-weet." That's it, you guys. So I'm not going to dig too deeply into that. I'm just going to let that incredible prose stand. It has been such a privilege to dive back into this book. I honestly just feel like there is nothing like it. I will also tell you that this is a really interesting book to reread. If this is one that you loved, but you haven't read it in a long time, it doesn't take long to read. There's lots of white space on the page. It really moves along, but it is incredibly resonant, and in some ways feels like exactly the book that we should all be reading right now. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.